Okay, so last week we began exploring why it is that the halachot and Yom Tov might be different than those on Shabbat, so that we'll understand halachically why they're different. So we noted that first of all, based on the pasuk, which says "Ach asher yachal chol nefesh ulevado yeyaseh lachem," that Yom Tov is the same as Shabbat, except that which is this elusive phrase of ochel nefesh, of that which is related to food. That is permitted on Yom Tov. And the Mishnah in Megillah, if you remember, succinctly says, Ein bein Shabbat le Yom Tov ela ochel nefesh bilvad, that this is the only difference between Shabbat and Yom Tov. Now that's presumably speaking about biblical law, that there's no difference except for this category of ochel nefesh. The Mishnah in Beitza adds to that Rabbanan's rabbinic law is the same way. Rabbinic law is also not different between Shabbat and Yom Tov. Nevertheless, the Gemara outlines that it's not quite so simple, and notes the machloket Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim about machshirei ochel nefesh, about preparatory stages in the food process, where you have a dispute as to whether or not that can be done on Yom Tov. And even within Rabbi Yehuda's position, the Gemara distinguishes between things that could have been done before Yom Tov, in which case even Rabbi Yehuda would forbid the preparatory stages on Yom Tov, which is not true of food preparation itself. Right? That can be done on Yom Tov, even if you could have done it in advance. But the prep stages, like sharpening your knife for shechita, that can only be done on Yom Tov if you couldn't have done it before. And then we noted that, to be honest, this isn't the only distinction. The Gemara really has others, such as the punishment. That on Shabbat, the punishment is the death penalty for violating a melacha. On Yom Tov, it is malkut. It's just a regular run-of-the-mill prohibition. And the concept of chiluk melachot, that on Shabbat, every violation of a melacha is considered a distinct violation, which, again, in case of intentional violation, makes no difference, because you can only kill somebody once. But when it comes to accidental sin, this manifests itself, because if you violate multiple melachot in one period of forgetfulness, you would be liable for one carbon each, and that doesn't apply on Yom Tov. And we suggested, and this is I think where we left off, that this may point to a fundamental conceptual difference between Shabbat and Yom Tov, where on Shabbat, because it's meant to commemorate the creation of the world and God's cessation of productive or constructive processes, so we do the same. And any act of violating a malacha is an act of heresy, is an act which denies the restful notion of the day. Where on Yom Tov, as the Chinuch outlines, it doesn't seem to be that way. But on Yom Tov, it sounds like we forbid malacha in order to ensure and enable you to have a restful day. But each malacha is less independently problematic. And that may be why ochel nefesh, why food-related malachot, so on Shabbat, they are problematic because they're creative. But on Yom Tov, we allow you to do things like prepare food, because that actually contributes rather than detracts from the spirit of the day. So that was where we had left off. Now, the next two things that we have to do, one we'll do this week, the next probably do next week, is the expansions of this and try to tease out the fundamental principle that's actually here. Next week we'll look at the expansions, because as we'll see, it's not quite as simple as we've made it out to be, if we've made it out to be simple, but it's not that simple, because there are expansions, which is based on principles that we'll see, such as mitoch, which means that, as the full phrase goes, mitoch shehutra l'tzarech, hutra nami shelo l'tzarech, since malacha was permitted for needs, so sometimes it's permitted even when it's not necessary, and we'll see what that means. Does it mean it's not necessary at all, or not necessary for the direct preparation of food, but it is necessary? That's a machloket, as we'll see, Rashi and Tosfot. That's an expansion of ochel nefesh. But before we do that, what we have to see is that despite the fact that the Gemara seems to sweepingly say that ochel nefesh is permitted, that's not obviously the case. So last week we saw the basic permission, but now we have to see that it is limited, and obviously that makes things more complicated, because you can't just say, well, something is food related, now it's automatically permitted, because what exactly it means for something to be food permitted is more complicated than that. So we were up to 14. So the Gemara in Beitza tells us as follows: Tanu Rabbanan ein osin tisnei ve'en kochin b'machdeshet. You can't prepare groats, right, which is this crushed wheat grain dish. But you can't grind grain with a mortar and pestle. So the Gemara says, Tarte, aren't these contradictory? Because the first one says you only can't make this ground grain dish, which apparently took a lot of effort, and that is prohibited. And the second one is more sweeping, which implies that you can't prepare anything with a mortar and pestle at all. So the Gemara says, "No hachi kamer matam ein osin tisnei lefeishen kochin b'machdeshet." So the Gemara says, you're right. You can't make this ground grain dish because you can't use the mortar and pestle. Belema ein kochin b'machdeshet. So why don't you just say you can't grind things with the mortar and pestle? Inami ein kochin machdeshet hava amina ani b'machdeshet gdola aval machdeshet ktana emer shaper dami. So the Gemara says, because you might have thought that you can't grind with a big grinder because it's too much work, because it has the appearance of a weekday activity, because normally when you crush something in the full size mortar and pestle, it's usually for where you're preparing for a few days rather than just for your meal, and therefore this is a weekday type activity. But you might have thought you could use a smaller one. So the Gemara says, Kamash Mulan, that's what it's teaching you. But the Gemara says, isn't there a brayta that tells us that you in fact can grind with a small grinder? He said, you're right, maybe you really can. Right? So Tanya Rava Amar Lo Kasha Halan Halu. Alternatively, this is out of order. Alternatively, one second, it's fine, I know you told me that. There we go. Okay. Alternatively, it depends whether you're in Bavel or in Eretz Yisrael. The interpretation they take here is whether the people doing it are the Jews, the owners of the house, or the servants, who might not be as careful with the distinctions. But that's really not our issue for the moment. But what you see already in the Gemara is that despite our seeming sweeping permission of Ochel Nefesh, the Gemara already tells you that it's not explicit whether this is rabbinic or biblical. There are food-related things which are not allowed, meaning preparing some sort of oatmeal, presumably, is food-related. And yet you see that it's prohibited because of tircha, or uvdin dechal, because it's too much effort, or it looks like a weekday activity. And what we see in many places is this notion that there are many malachot that as much as we might have thought that you could do anything on Yom Tov for food, it turns out that that's not the case. Another example is also in Beit Yudalid is borer. So the Gemara says, the Mishnah says really, Hamborer kitnud b'Yom Tov Beit Shammai omrim borer v'ochel v'ochel. Beit Hillel omrim borer kedarko b'cheiko v'kanona v'tamchoi. Beit Shammai says, look, you separate and eat it immediately. Separate and eat it immediately. Beit Hillel says, no, you can even separate things normally, and even with a vessel of sorts, but not avalo b'tavav lo v'nafav lo v'kvara, but not with the highly specialized, designated separating vessels like a sieve. And Rabbi Gamliel says you can even rinse them off to get the refuse off the top. So Tanya Amar Rabbi Gamliel b'medvar mamurim kishaochel merubeh al psolet. This is where there's more food than not food, right? I mean, here they call it refuse, but that's not really great. It's what you're not eating. But if there's more psolet, so then everyone agrees that you can pull out the food. So Gemara says, does anyone say that in that case that it's permitted? So the Gemara says it must be a case where it's greater in effort, but it's smaller in size. So even though there's more food than non-food, since it takes more effort to remove the bad, so you're allowed to remove the food. Now again, without getting to the details of borer, again what you see is the Gemara, borer is a preparatory food action, and yet the Gemara, because of tircha, because of effort, or because of uvdin dechol or something like that, but here it sounds more like tircha, right? That it's too strenuous. The Gemara does not allow you to prepare food normally on Yom Tov, and therefore you see that as much as it seems like a sweeping permission given in the Gemara, it's not, right? There are cases that are at least rabbinically prohibited. Yeah.
I just want to say that, like, also here, it seems like it has the exact same qualifications as Shabbat, right? You have to, like, take the food.
Right. So this is actually one of the interesting things of whether this is identical or not.
At least the Mishnah.
Yeah. Right, but in the Gemara it says, "But the Gemara says that it depends, right? It depends on if there's more food or more psolet, and then you might be able to do the opposite, right? Which on Shabbat is not true, right? But on Yom Tov it might be true. But you're right. I mean, the psolet ochel distinction is true on Shabbat and Yom Tov.
Do we classify like this? I mean, do we make distinctions like when it comes to borer and everything on Yom Tov? I feel like, I mean, if we do, I just like never knew.
I mean, we do, but like, you know, what you're as you're eating something is not like, right? If you're doing it as you're about to eat, it's not a problem anyways, right? But even on Shabbat, right? If like you do it like
What if you're gonna. Like,
tolet, etc. What?
grinding something.
What?
Like borer.
Oh, and toche.
What were you talking about?
I mean, the one before, on toche. Yeah, right? We really do that. Now, again, with, smaller quantities of things that aren't such work is not a big deal, right? The Gemara says it's limited to things that take a lot of work to grind, right? This is not this is not garlic in a garlic press. This is, a mortar and pestle, which I don't know if you're ever going to use, meaning, I mean, maybe, I guess if people make, what's it called? Pesto, I guess sometimes people are very fancy will make it with like a mini mortar and pestle, but I don't know how often you even see it. Like that's not okay. And the Gemara in Beitza as well limit, and Chav Gimel limits what cases you're allowed to go fishing and trapping animals. And the Gemara in Shabbos in 17 limits making cheese on Shabbos, because you could have made cheese before Shabbos. Okay? Maybe we'll come back to the examples more, but I want to get to the main principles today. So, what though does Ochel Nefesh actually mean, right? What does it permit? If we want to understand this fundamental distinction, we need to understand what it is. So, conceptually, tell me, what are the possibilities? Right, we've said that on Yom Tov we're allowed to perform halacha that are food related, but we see that doesn't include everything. Okay? So, right, and no one would argue that it includes, let's say, planting. Even though planting is food related down the line, no one would say that that's included. So, what exactly, how do we define Ochel Nefesh such that we can explain the limitations on the dispensation to perform malachot for Ochel Nefesh, right? What possibilities do we have conceptually to explain it, right? What does it mean? Right? We've talked about why there might be such a difference, and we've seen that it's not universal. But now we got to say, okay, well, what is this thing then? Right? What we've done is said there is such a thing. It makes sense in the context of Yom Tov. What does it actually mean? Yeah.
I don't like the whole uvdin dechol thing because I feel like you can say that about anything.
Good. So uvdin dechol is more on the rabbinic category, right? That's the Gemara says certain things the Gemara identifies as weekday activities, right? And you're right, uvdin dechol is very complicated, and it's one of the things we're going to have to see. And yes, there's literally an entire dissertation written on this topic, which I read over the summer last year, attempting to come up with a good definition. And you're right, it's not clear there is a good definition for what uvdin dechol means, but that's more rabbinic, though we'll see it might sometimes border on the doraita. But let's take the Ochel Nefesh itself, right? What is the limit? What are the limits of this heter on a biblical level. Right? What is and what is not ochel nefesh? Why is it that we say that cooking is ochel nefesh, but planting food is not ochel nefesh? Right? Everyone agrees to that. That's a basic fact. But why? Right? Why not? What exactly? It is food related. Eventually, if I'm planting an apple tree, not for this Yom Tov, or but eventually it's food related. Eventually, I would hope, assuming you're successful at growing a fruit tree. So, what's the difference? Right? What exactly, if we wanted to cut to the definition, cut to the nature of the fundamental nature of ochel nefesh, what does it mean? Yeah.
I mean, like anything that's for the Yom Tov itself, that would be positive, and if it's not completely positive, outweigh the negatives at least. Like in terms of like tircha and stuff like that.
So let's leave tircha for a moment.
All those things we should forget about.
Well, you know what? Actually, no. Let's see what formulations there are. So yeah, okay. So try it again.
I mean, okay.
It's not wrong. So try it again. Let's try to pin it down.
So something that is for that time itself, meaning like cooking would be for that day, planting would be for in a few months.
Okay, good. So one possible distinction is, so let me push it a little bit farther. The fundamental distinction you made is something that's for Yom Tov itself and something which is food related but it's for after Yom Tov. Okay, fair enough. But let's push that a little bit farther. Do you mean anything which this particular act right now is for Yom Tov? It's permitted, no matter what it is. And any act that I'm doing right now for food that's not for this Yom Tov is prohibited, no matter what it is. Possibility one. Or do you mean any type of malacha that normally is done for preparation that day is permitted, and any type of act which is normally long-term is prohibited, regardless of whether I'm actually using it for today? Which one do you mean?
Option one.
What?
Option one.
Okay. That's fair. So, Abigail takes the position that what ochel nefesh basically means is, look, anything which is for today is fine, no matter what it is. And anything for food today is permitted no matter what it is. And anything which is not is going to be prohibited. So, do you think that's true of any malacha? What if I could find a violation, quote-unquote violation of building that was food-related for today? Would it be permitted or prohibited? Permitted or permitted? What?
Building an oven.
What?
Permitted.
Permitted. So building an oven might be 2 steps removed. So you'd have to figure out what it would be, right? That might depend on Yehuda. Good. So Abigail takes one of the most extreme positions that's found in Rishonim, but is indeed found in the Rishonim. And that is Tosfot. So, I'm not going to go in order here. I will go based on the suggestions that you throw out. So, let's find it. Here, look at 26. So, 26. This is a Tosfot in Shabbat. So, we just saw that making cheese on Yom Tov is prohibited, but the Gemara said, the Rishonim assume that that's only rabbinic. The making cheese on Yom Tov is only prohibited rabbinically because you could have made it before. Okay. Tosfot says as follows: Miu tema luri kevan demutar legabein b'yom tov min haTorah. The Ri asked, since it's permitted to make cheese on Yom Tov biblically, afilu be'efshar, even if you could have made it before Yom Tov, right? The limitations to make it on Yom Tov are only rabbinic. Afilu lo yehei. Actually, no. Sorry, Tosfot is more extreme than Abigail. But we'll see how far this can go. Tosfot says, "Afilu lo yehei mutar midirabanan, ela b'lo efshar." It's only rabbinically prohibited if you couldn't do it before. Sorry, other way around, right? It's permitted in Yom Tov if you couldn't do it before. Ela imkein nafal beito b'Yom Tov. If that's the case, so if your house fell down on Yom Tov, yehei mutar livnoto b'Yom Tov. It should be permitted to build your house on Yom Tov. Dimitoch shehutar binyan l'tzorech dimigabein heve mishum boneh. Since biblically you're allowed to make cheese on Yom Tov. That shows you that building is a malacha that could be used for ochel nefesh. And once something, any malacha could in any possible way be ever construed to be for food, so then Tosfot says that malacha forever is only rabbinically prohibited on Yom Tov.
But cheese has something to do with actual food.
Correct.
Food.
Correct, and it's only prohibited rabbinically.
So, like, how can they, like, darshan that out, I guess?
So Tosfot has this very radical position that any malacha that could possibly use for food, possible, the whole malacha becomes permitted automatically. Okay? Which is much more extreme than Avigail. Now, this is a bit wild, right, as things go, right? Tosfot thinks that building, right, building is asur on Yom Tov. Is mutter on Yom Tov on a biblical level, simply because there is one particular case in which building could be used for food, which tells you that it is permitted. Now, I just got to get this in order here. Okay. Yeah, I think I have these in order now. Okay. So, let me frame it this way. Okay? In general, in Torah, whenever we have a prohibition that is then waived, so there are at least two main ways of conceptualizing why something which is normally prohibited, becomes permitted. In the Gemara's language, and the Gemara uses this in the context of Tuma B'tzibur, right? The halacha is that if the majority of Klal Yisrael, the majority of the Jewish people are impure, when it comes Karban Pesach time, so what's the halacha? You're allowed to bring the Karban Pesach. Now, you're allowed to bring the Karban Pesach, but only if the majority of Klal Yisrael is impure. If the minority is impure, so then what's the halacha?
They bring it on Pesach Sheni.
They bring it on Pesach Sheni. Right? The people who are pure bring it on Pesach Rishon. The people who are not pure bring it on Pesach Sheni. So the Gemara asks the question, well, what is the nature of this dispensation? When we say that you're allowed to bring the Karban, so how do we view, right? Normally, you're not allowed to. Normally, you can't bring the Karban Pesach if you're Tameh. So why is it that when you have a tzibur, you're allowed to? So the Gemara suggests two formulations. Hutra or dichuya. What is hutra or dichuya? So what it means, seemingly, is hutra means that once this dispensation is built in, so, I mean, what's hutra? Hutar.
It's allowed.
Yeah, it's allowed, meaning normally it's prohibited, and now it is permitted. The Isser has been waived completely. Dichuya means, what does dichuya mean? It's pushed off. It's held in abeyance. Meaning, one way of conceptualizing it is that once you have a heter, it becomes totally permitted. The other is to say, no, it's something which is fundamentally problematic, but you're allowed to do it anyways. Right? And the Gemara notes that there are differences in terms of how expansive we are, in terms of applying it. Right? When you talk about hutra, you don't need to justify the dispensation anymore because it's completely permitted. If it's dichuya, then what you're saying is really the prohibition exists, it's just held in abeyance. So you might have to justify the act each time in order to trigger the dispensation. Now, when I was in Shir by Rulochenstein, he suggested that there really is a third possibility, which is which might be conflated with hutra, but it might also be a little bit different than hutra, which is what he called, as I remember it, lo ne'emra. What does lo ne'emra mean?
It's just not said.
Yeah, meaning, what is that? What did he mean? He meant, it could just be that it's a category mistake. Meaning that you thought that this should be included in the prohibition. But it's not, right? It's not that it's waived, even entirely. It's just that, conceptually, it wasn't part of it. You thought it would because there are certain similarities between case A and case B, but it's just, right, it's just not true. Like, so for example, normally you're not allowed to use the right. You're not allowed to use like a public street for a block party, right? That's blocking traffic. It's not your property. Okay. Now, if you get a permit, so then
you can have a block party.
Then you can have the block party, and now you'll say it's either, you can argue, is it hutra in the sense that, or is it dechuya? It might depend. Did you get a blanket dispensation to use the street, which maybe is similar to hutra, right? You said I can use this between these hours and whatever you use it for, or do you say it's a dechuya, let's say, which is, right, I can only use it for the purposes that I set out. So if I said I was going to use it for a block party, I can't now use it for a political rally. I don't know. Okay? But if I asked you, why are you allowed to have a party in your house, right? You wouldn't say, oh, there's a prohibition against, using public space, and I got a dispensation. It's waived when it's your private property. You would just say, right, lo ne'emra, right? Meaning, what are you talking about, right? There is no problem in using my private house for a party. I don't need a dispensation. It's just not prohibited, right? It's just not. So which of these is ochel nefesh? So, let's look at the Ramban. Right? When Ruchenstein said that there's the most extreme formulation, which some people will call hutra, but maybe is even more than hutra, is lo ne'emra, is the Ramban. So look at number 25. Well, 24 and 25. The pasuk says, "Vayom rishon mikra kodesh yelachem kol melechet avodah lo ta'asu." The Ramban notes that when it comes to Yom Tov, it doesn't say that you can't do any malacha. What does it say? Melechet avodah. Don't do melechet avodah. So what's the difference between malacha and melechet avodah? So Ramban suggests that this isn't just a slightly different terminology. It reflects a intrinsic difference between Shabbat and Yom Tov. That on Shabbat, melacha is prohibited, and on Yom Tov, only melechet avodah is prohibited. And this is how he writes. He says, Kol melechet avodah. Afilu hamilachot hachashuvot lochem avodah v'tzorech sheish chisaron kis bevatala shelahen. Even those melachot, which are your work, and you need them because without doing them you'll lose money. Kigon davara aved, right, things that will cause you a monetary loss if you don't do them. Kach evanti mitorat kohanim. Even those are prohibited on Yom Tov. That's what I understand from the Midrash Halacha. The Kitani yachal afechol shamoed yasr melachat avodah, because the Torah Kohanim says you might have thought that those types of melachot are prohibited even on Chol HaMoed. Kamashmon, it's not. It's only on Yom Tov. Lashon Rashi. Ve'einenu nachon klal. He says this is just wrong. Kimatam shiomar kadu lo tasem melechet davara aved. Ve'yavo shar melachot b'kal v'chomer. Why would the Torah come and tell you can't do things that you'll lose money for? Imken ra'oi shiomar b'Shabbat king. You should have said that on Shabbat. Meaning it's just obvious, right? Shabbat and Yom Tov, this question of monetary loss is just not relevant. And furthermore, if his drasha was right, so then you'd have a hint that monetary loss is, the laws of monetary loss in Chol HaMoed are hinted at in the Torah, and yet the Gemara, as the Ramban understands it, says that the malacha in Chol HaMoed is only us to Rabbanan. So therefore, he says, and this is his actual thesis, 5 lines down. Lashon avodah kolelhu kol milacha v'shimushim oved admato yisbal lechem v'avadcha sheishanim. Avodah in Torah generally means working the field, v'avatorevecha, service to your enemies. Ve'eno mishamesh b'shum makom b'davar avid b'lvad. It has nothing to do with monetary loss. Shim lo tasa hayom lo tasa l'machar. Perush melechet avodah kol melacha she'ina l'tzorach ochel nefesh. Melechet avodah means any melacha which isn't ochel nefesh, isn't food related. Meaning, kinyan shneimar sheish yamim tavod basitza kol melachtecha v'chol avodah basadeh u'vatem zratem. U'melacha shehi be'ochel nefesh, and a melacha which is food related, is not called melachat avodah. It's called melachat hana'ah. It's not called work. It's called an effort of enjoyment, of pleasure. Melachat hana'ah, lo melachat avodah. V'zemit ba'er b'torah ki b'chag hamatzot she'amar tchila kol melacha lo ta'asu la'asor kol melacha she'ein ochel nefesh u'lehodia she'ochel nefesh mutar b'hen v'lo yomar katuv le'olam be'echad mikol shar tovim kol melacha yomim tovim kol melacha v'lo yefaresh b'hem heter ochel nefesh ki melachat avodah. Right, besides for the first time you hear about Yom Tov, where God has to tell you all malacha except for ochel nefesh is permitted, after that it just uses this phrase, melachat avodah, gilamed al zeh, to teach you. Aval particle b'chor, b'chag hamatzot, omer b'yom shvi, etc., etc. Etc. l'Hashem l'gecha, l'das melacha, v'tam b'bnei, shekvar hitr bo b'feirosh ochel nefesh, because where he said ochel nefesh permitted, v'lo tzorich lo omar kol melachat avodah. Sker melacha stam, lo omar kol melacha. Kemo nemar b'Shabbat. He said that's why on Yom Tov, it never says all malacha is prohibited. Because not all malacha is prohibited. Only malacha avodah. Ki hakavana lo taseh malacha she'er ticha le'am. And what is melechet? What's the difference, according to him, between melechet avodah and melachat hana'ah? So look 2 lines from the bottom. Perush. Melachat avodah melacha mishtameret la'avodat kinyan kigon zriya k'tzira v'chafira v'chayotze behem. Aval ochel nefesh eina melacha avodah zeh. The difference is that ochel nefesh is things like cooking. And what's melachat avodah? Things that are normally done for storage, for long-term use, for business. So, planting and plowing, sure, down the road is for food, but as an act, it's not considered melachet hana'ah, it's not considered ochel nefesh, because this is work. This is long-term planning, and that is malacha, that is avodah. So what the Ramban claims, if you put this in its most radical form, essentially, is that it's not just that malacha, which is related to ochel nefesh, it's not really hutra, it never happened. Meaning, on Shabbat there are 39 malachot, and on Yom Tov there are 33, or whatever it is. Right? And these malachot just don't exist. The difference is something work-related or the food-related ones. And by food-related, we don't mean like food down the road. We mean food preparation, which is defined as melachat hana'ah and melachat avodah. So the Ramban seems to take the position that ochel nefesh is not prohibited at all. However, on the one hand, this is very expansive, and we'll see, we'll have to limit this eventually, but on one hand, it's very expansive. But there is a implicit limitation, if you believe the Ramban. What's the limitation? The limitation is that you can't believe like Tosfot. Right? Because according to the Ramban, it's not about whether this is actually for food preparation. It's the types of malachot that are normally about food preparation are permitted because they're not even called malacha. So that obviously means that those malachot you would expect to have tremendous leeway, even in things that maybe in a limited sense are not considered food-related. But on the other hand, what would you also expect from a conceptualization like the Ramban?
That everything else is very strictly prohibited.
Correct, and therefore, Tosfot, he's never going to say like Tosfot, right? Because Tosfot says building is permitted for cheese, right? And therefore you can build your house, right? The Ramban would say, are you crazy? Right? Building is a melechet avodah. Now, he might have to explain why cheese making is permitted. We'll have to come back to that. So the Ramban, I would suggest, has one model, which is the lo nemra model, right? That certain malachot on Yom Tov are just not really what we're talking about. They're not really asur, right? They don't even need a dispensation. They're just, right, cut out of the original definition. Tosfot, on the other hand, seems to take what I would say is an extreme hutra position. Namely, any malacha that could plausibly be used for food, the malacha becomes permitted. that sounds to me more like a hutro model, meaning it's a dispensation, and once I can eke out the dispensation on any particular malacha, so then it's going to be quite sweeping. Right? But it's not about the nature of the malacha. It's not that certain malachot are in and certain are out. It's if I can find a way in which a certain malacha is relevant for food preparation, so then that shows that there are cases in which it's permitted, and once it's permitted, I don't have to pay on a biblical level any attention to the exact details. So that to me sounds very much like a hutra model. It's definitely not a dechuya model, right? Because he says that even building your house is only asur derabanan, because you could have used building for food preparation. That's not dechuya. Dechuya means that the isser is held in abeyance, and every time you want to permit it, you have to justify it. And that's not this either. Now, another model of the either lo nemra or maybe hutra model appears in the Yerushalmi in number 22. Yerushalmi says as follows: Ein borin, Tani, ein borin v'lo tochanin v'lo meraktin. You can't separate, you can't grind. Haborer v'atochen merakit b'Shabbat nizkal v'Yom Tov sofek et arba'in. On Shabbat it's the death penalty, on Yom Tov it is malkut. The Gemara says, "Vatinin barakedarka b'cheiko v'tamchoy." Didn't we say that you're allowed to separate? We already saw that. So Amar Rav Chanina, Antiyana de Rabbi Gamliel Amar Af Mediach v'Shole. He said that's the position of Rabbi Gamliel, who we saw is very permissive. V'atani shabei Rabbi Gamliel hayu shochkin pilpulin reichayim zelayin umutter litchon vaser lavor. But he said, but wait a second, we found that even Rabbi Gamliel permitted grinding, we didn't always permit separating. So Amar Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Bon lo hutra tchina kidarka. Normal tchina, normal grinding is not permitted. Minayin she'ein barim lo tochden lo markiden. And how do you know that you can't grind and you can't do some of these early processes of separation? So Rav Acha v'shem Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish kol melacha lo yasef bohem adu shmartem et amatzot. Rabbi Yossi bai klum lomdu l'tavshel mikan. So that is a very obscure drasha, but let me explain what he just did. He said, it says don't do malacha in adjacent to a description of matzah. And therefore the Yerushalmi says, you know what that means? What does that mean? That only the things that would be used for matzah preparation and on in malacha is permitted. Which, as we'll see in the Rishonim, what they think that means is milisha va'elach. That we have a gzeirat hakatuv, the acha sheyachal chol nefesh ulevado yaseh lachem, things that are food related are permitted, but only from the point at which you'd be making matzah. And at what point does something start being considered matzah? From the process of kneading. But anything that's earlier in the food process doesn't count. So if you look at the Ran writes in 23, first he goes through a lot of the limitations that we saw. Right? The fact that you can't hunt everything that you want, and you can't grind everything that you want, and that clearly ochel nefesh doesn't mean everything. So he notes, let's see, look down, it's like 15 lines down. Where he quotes the Yerushalmi, and he says, Tani chizga b'agach l'arur me'otin, mikan shel yiksav yitchon l'raka b'yom tov, u'muchach adam debrei k'beinayu, mikol makom, nira mishitara Yerushalmi, what you see from the Yerushalmi, shatchina v'chayot ben asura min Torah, that grinding, which is before lisha, right, grinding, which is before kneading, in the process of bread preparation, is prohibited. Simply because it's too early in the process. Now he notes, our Gemara doesn't seem to take this conceptualization because it allows to sharin and shchikat pilpulin, because it allows you to grind spices. According to Yerushalmi, anything that's before Lisha, even if it's obviously food related, would be prohibited. And the Yerushalmi, the only reason you could do it was because they were doing it not in the normal way. And the Ramban writes in his Sefer Melchamot, meaning the commentary on the Rif, the Ramban says the only type of malacha that's permitted is things for food. But to hunt something which is not in your property yet, or to cut things, right? He notes that the Ramban, who's his Rebbe's Rebbe, says that the difference are things that are. Now he has a slightly different formulation here than the Ramban al Torah. Right, he says that what's the difference between melechet avodah and melechet not avodah? Is it the type of thing that you do when it's already in your property or not? Right, hunting, cutting is not really under your control yet. Right, it's basically house-related malachot versus field-related malachot, or the malachot that it takes to get food into your house. And then he continues, he says, Inami kamoshim first b'Yerushalmi v'chol zeinu maspikli lama yasser litchon chitim min ataravi muter laducho and ilchin kedarkan. He said, this isn't fully understandable to me yet. And he goes on, he offers a different formulation. So you have here a different, I think, version of the Ramban. Right, where you have, the Ramban says it's the difference between Melecha and Melachat Avodah. According to the Yerushalmi just said, look, it's not all food-related Melachot that are permitted. It depends. Is it before or after kneading in the matzah baking process? Right, if it's before, then it just doesn't get the dispensation. If it's after, then it gets the dispensation. And again, is this Hutra or Lonemra? I'm not totally sure. But what we have is that according to the Ramban and the Yerushalmi in different ways, those things, those malachot that are really food related, fundamentally are totally permitted. And therefore, even though we'll see some limitations, we should expect those limitations to be nominal, perhaps to only be rabbinic, right, but not biblical, because on a biblical level these aren't even malachot. Tosfot has a radical Hutra position, right, where Tosfot says, look, it's not like, any malacha that's food-related versus field-related, or any malacha which is before or after Lisha. Tosfot just says, look, if I can eke out a reason why something is permitted, so then the whole malacha becomes permitted. Now in that world, which sounds more Hutra, because he's not relating to the nature of the malacha, right? He's just relating to whether I can find some sort of case in which the malacha is indeed permitted rather. So then that malacha will always be permitted. But even according to Tosfot, I would not expect so many limitations. On the other hand, if you took the position of dichuya, if you conceptualized malacha on Yom Tov is fundamentally asur, but if it's for food, it's permitted, so then I would expect, on the one hand, that it would apply less expansively, right? I'd have to justify it in terms of food preparation more locally, rather than as a category. But on the other hand, I might also expect that it could be more expansive in the terms of application, meaning something which is not fundamentally a food-related malacha, but in this particular instance is food-related, so there, I would expect it to be permitted. Because if you think it's dechuya, what you're saying is, look, really it's asur, but whenever it's for food, so then I waive the asur. So then, it may not be that I can waive it when there's no food preparation, but in a case where there is food preparation, I would be able to waive the prohibition, even on a not normally food-related malacha. The last thing to note, though, is that it could be that the truth is going to be a hybrid position, right? Because theoretically, you could say, look, there are certain types of melachot that are permitted, whether or not you need them on Yom Tov, because they're fundamentally permitted. And there are other melachot that are not fundamentally permitted, but can be permitted when necessary. And we'll see that that's essentially going to be the position of the Rambam. That the Rambam, on most melachot, doesn't take a super expansive position, with two exceptions. With the exception of cooking and havara, and lighting a flame. Sorry, carrying and havara. Lighting a flame and carrying, where the Rambam says they are totally permitted. Right, so you could have hybrid positions. Let's see some of these inside. What time is it, by the way?
4 o'clock exactly.
4 o'clock. Okay.
Wait,
So
who says the carrying and cooking thing?
we'll see it in the Rambam. Right? The Rambam thinks that carrying and cooking are the exceptions. That most of them he has a limited perspective, except for carrying and cooking. Now, the reason I didn't want to get into them in detail this week is because that's based on his conceptualization of mitoch, which we'll have to look at next week. But let's look at some of the other shitot in Rishonim. So let's look for a moment at the Rush. Let's try the Rush, okay? So take the Rush in 21. 21? Yeah. The Rush in 21. Okay? Oh, God. Okay, so I want to take the Rush.
Do you want to stand in the shade?
Yeah, the sun keeps moving. It was shadier there. Okay. This is... No, it's fine. This is... Well, now I'm in the... No.
Do you want to stand there?
It's fine.
Why don't you stand over there and we'll move
Unless your shadows
you're
like
going to have to keep moving your line. Also, your water's in the sun, so it's going to get hot.
Alright.
Yeah.
Oh, that's not as much of a big deal. Okay.
Are you sure we can move? It's okay.
Corona.
Probably better.
This Corona
not
thing.
dehydrated.
That's probably true. Okay. So, let's look at the Rush. Okay? So, the Rush says, Ein sadin dagim min abibrim b'yom tov. Right? You don't fish on Yom Tov, and you don't put food in front of them. But you can hunt animals and birds and give them food. Not all animal pens are equivalent. This is the rule. Anything which is lacking hunting, meaning it still takes effort for you to grab it, even though it's like you hunted it from the field into the pen, but if it's a massive pen, and you still have to run around to get it, so then it's prohibited. So mitoch perish Rashi, mashma d'tzeit asur midaraita. The Rashi says it sounds like from Rashi that hunting is biblically prohibited. Kinatam ledavara d'tzeit asur midaraita tfei mishchita, because he explains why hunting is worse than shechting, v'afio, bishul, mishum, t'cholhani adifi tvei hayom, mishim nazav me'etbol, because all of these are better if done today than before Yom Tov. Aval tzeda, but hunting, efshar me'etbol, v'yanichem mitzuda b'mayim ad lamachar, but hunting or fishing, you could always do in advance and then just store the animal in water or in a small pen. Ulekaman, lo mashma achi, but it doesn't sound this way later on. Because Rabbi Yehuda distinguishes between things that you could have done before Yom Tov and things that you can only do on Yom Tov when it comes to machshir and when it comes to the preparatory stages. Michlal, which implies then when it comes to things that are actually food related, it doesn't matter. Now, what do you already see from Rashi? As the Rush quotes him, which model does Rashi work the best with? So I would say dechuya, because what does Rashi say? Right, the Rush says that on a biblical level, when it comes to ochel nefesh itself, it doesn't matter whether you could have done it in advance or not. It's permitted, and therefore it's permitted. Rashi says even ochel nefesh itself, there are certain cases when, if I could have done it before Yom Tov, I can't do it on Yom Tov. Now that sounds like a dechuya model, because what are you saying? Really, it's prohibited, but we'll waive the prohibition to allow you to prepare food. But if you could have done it before Yom Tov, so then there's no reason for me to hold the Yisr in abeyance because you could have done it in a different way. So if I had to now outline the models, I would say Rashi, who says that on a biblical level, when it comes to food itself, there's a difference between whether you could have done it before Yom Tov and not. I would say that sounds very much like Dechuya. Right? That really, we conceptualize Ochel Nefesh as being prohibited. It's just that we waive it if necessary, but not necessary, then we don't. The Ramban, the Ran say, no. There are certain malachot that just don't go in the category, period, end of story. Whether it's from Lisha and on, or it's work-related malachot versus Malachat Hana'ah. And then you have super hutra models like Tosfot who say, look, anything I can eke out a heter for, so then suddenly I magically make everything mutter. The Rush, though, already notes that it could be that there's a distinction. So I already said, like from the Rambam, as we'll see, there might be a difference between malachot. But before we even get to distinctions in malacha, there's one more very likely distinction, which is the difference between ochel nefesh and machshirei ochel nefesh, between direct food preparation and the preparatory stages of food preparation, meaning two stages removed. Because what does the Rosh say? The Rosh says, look, when it comes to machshirei ochel nefesh, even if you permit them, it makes sense to distinguish between things that you could have done before Yom Tov and things that you couldn't have. Which makes sense, because machshirei ochel nefesh aren't directly food related. They're things which are two steps removed from food related. So if you could have done it before, we don't let you do it. If not, so then we'll allow it. But that's a very much a dechuya model. But when it comes to ochel nefesh itself, food preparation itself, it's much more expansive. That it's permitted even if you could have done it before Yom Tov. And therefore he says, Umi de Rabbi Yehuda nishma l'Rabbanan. From Yehuda we can imply from Rabbanan. By ochel nefesh itself, lo pligi el Rabbanan hu de gazer al ktziru v'tziru tchina. Ochel nefesh on a biblical level, there's no difference whether you could have done it in advance or not. But rabbinically there is. The fish adam ragil it's kamo ke'echad v'lo tzadeu ke'echad v'lo chanar b'yachad v'lo jochanav b'yachad. Because cutting things in the field and gathering and things like that, people do far in advance. L'chein asru kol elu didami lov didachal. So all these are sort of weekday-like. Mitam ze nami asru tzeidah. So that's why they prohibit hunting as well. Kipamim tam tzadatu dagam harbe v'dami lov didachal. Because sometimes you'll end up hunting a lot or fishing a lot, which will look like a weekday activity. So therefore, the Rosh says that biblically, all these malachot that are food-related are permitted. Rabbinically, we distinguish between things that normally are done in advance and things that are not. But not biblically, right? Which is another possible distinction, right? That biblically we'll care. We won't care about whether things could have been done in advance, but rabbinically we will. And then he quotes the Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi, the Garcinato, Minayin Shein Tochen Vein Borer and Vein Merakte. Tamid Lomar, Ach Asher Yochel Chol Nefesh, Ushmartem and Amatzot, Klomar Milisha Ve'elach. Right, the Rosh says, yeah, you see in the Yerushalmi from the Matzot Pasuk, Shmartem and Amatzot, that anything from kneading and on is permitted. V'lo Melachot Shekodem Alisha, and nothing that is before Lisha. So here we see, right, in the Rishonim already and the Yerushalmi, basically these three models, right? Rashi, which sounds like a Dechuya model, right? Because he says, even on a biblical level, we care about whether food preparation itself could have been done before Yom Tov or not, which sounds like things are only permitted if you can actively justify them in terms of food preparation, therefore there are limitations. The Ramban and the Yerushalmi, which sounds like, look, there's certain malachot that just don't count. Maybe rabbinically they do, but not biblically. And then Tosa, which sounds like, look, a hutra model. But then we always have to remember that there might be distinctions, rabbinically, where this might only be true biblically, but as we saw, rabbinically, there are plenty of things which are prohibited. Which, in the Gemara, it sounds like, because it looks like weekday activity. But it also might be, as the Rosh notes, that what does it mean, weekday activity? It's the type of thing that's normally done in advance. And therefore, what the Rashi says is de'oraita, we might disagree with de'oraita and yet paskin d'Rabbanan. Meaning, biblically, we might say it doesn't matter whether you prepare it in advance or not. But rabbinically, we do care. And rabbinically we'll say anything that could have been done, or the types of halacha that could have been done in advance, have to be done in advance. And the malachot they can't, so they don't have to be. So the distinctions that we need to keep in mind in general are, right, how expansive do we think the prohibition is? At hutra dechuya lo nemra. Then the layers of rabbinic prohibition. We have to keep in mind, in any given time, are we talking about ochel nefesh itself, or machshirei ochel nefesh, where by food preparation itself we tend to find more permission, whereas by the preparatory stages we find less. I think, what time is it? 4:10. So I think I'm going to have to leave then the Rambam. So we'll see already next week. Here, I gave you Shulchan Aruch, but really that was probably a methodological mistake, right? Because, I just want you to think about it, so I don't want you to see, what Shulchan Aruch has codified. What we'll see is that this is only part of the story. Because there is another category in halacha called mitoch, which is that certain times we permit things definitely, even though they're not technically food preparation, because we define food preparation more expansively than food preparation. Which I know that sounds weird, but that's essentially what we do. So for example, what we'll see next week is that anything which is what's called hana'at haguf, right, which is for bodily enjoyment, we consider it an expansion of ochel nefesh. So, for example, the Gemara says that everyone agrees you're allowed to heat up water to wash your hands and face. Because even though that's not food, the universal enjoyment that people get from at least cleaning their hands and face is essentially, for halachic purposes, equivalent to ochel nefesh. It's not actually ochel nefesh, but it is because of mitoch shehutra l'tzarech, that once it's permitted for food, hutra shelo l'tzarech, it's permitted for other things. Now that category is very important because what exactly it means seems to be a derivative of what we talked about this week. Meaning, the extent to which we think that ochel nefesh is a sweeping heter will explain how much we could possibly expand it to things that are not directly food related. And we'll have to see that next week. And as we'll see, that's where we're going to see the Rambam's unique position, where he's going to take this hybrid, that certain malachot, havara and hotza'ah, where the Gemara really invokes mitoch, he's going to take a much more expansive, permissive model. By other malachot, he's not necessarily going to. Okay. I just want to note that we'll see. Tosfot gets very little discussion, lemaisa, right? Because it's quite extreme, right? It's a little bit weird to say biblically you're allowed to build your house. But even though it's probably not going to be quoted much in later literature, I want you to keep it in mind because, and when we get to talk about electricity, remember that according to some people, it's boneh, it's building, right? Now, that means that even if they're right, there is at least one major shita in Rishonim that it would still be permitted on Yom Tov, at least biblically. And if you're using it for food, then it would be permitted lechatchila. So that may not be something I would jump to, right? Like right away and say, oh, Tosfot thinks you can do bonus, so even if you think electricity is bonus, it's permitted, right? But it's important to keep in mind because that means that if you wanted to and you want to construct a position, especially if you want to construct multiple directions to be matir or something, to remember that there is a shita that may not be quoted too much but does exist by a major Rishon, that even building could be permitted biblically. So then that's a way of attenuating even the most stringent positions on electricity on Shabbos and Yom Tov, right? Because then at least according to one shita it's permitted, right? So even though it's not maybe a majority position, I think it's important to remember, because the way Psak works a lot is not just here's the most plausible argument, it's here's the most plausible argument, but even within the less plausible ones, let me give you a reason why it might be mutter, right? What we call a snif lahakel, right? It's another reason to be mutter, right? It's not the main argument, but if you want me to put up multiple arguments to slowly chip away at the plausibility that it's usser and to build up the plausibility that it's mutter, so sometimes you can pull out shita that might not be quoted too much, right? So that's just something that I would throw out there in theory. I don't know if I'd be even willing to say it, but it's definitely something that logically has a coherence to it, whether or not it's something you would invoke. Okay, next week we'll do the expansion. We'll see the toch. So